Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about objectivity and subjectivity, or something being objective versus something being subjective. And these are important components, and there's a lot of different ways of approaching these. But this is a rhetoric channel, so particularly we're going to think about these as rhetorical stances or rhetorical approaches to presenting information. So, basically, the terms themselves kind of actually tell you what they mean, but in a way that may or may not be all that helpful, right? So, objectivity is rooted in the object. Subjectivity is rooted in the subject. So, again, the words tell you what they mean, but that may or may not be helpful, right? So when I say that objectivity means that it is an observation or language or whatever it is that is rooted in the object, what that means is that it is rooted in the external world, apart from the question of an observer. So, something like all right, we'll take a very simple example, right? The color of my hat. This is a dark blue hat, navy blue hat, whatever we want to categorize it as. It exists. As such, it has that quality to it, apart from the question of whether anyone is observing it. Now, we might get into some debates about, like, is it navy blue, is it dark blue, or whatever it is, and this is where maybe terminology becomes slippery, but if we take sort of dark blue to encompass a range of colors, it is a range of shades, rather. It is a dark blue hat. That is a thing that is true about it, and we can sort of look at it in the external world, right? We can say, yes, that is true. Typically, things that are objective are measurable. They are documentable in some way, whether that's through observation, whether that's through scientific measurement, whether that's through the gathering of data that is maybe quantifiable in some way, that's numerical, whatever it is, right? So the speed of gravity. This is an objective piece of information about the universe, right? It exists. Whether or not any subject, any human being or conscious entity or whatever it is, observes it, is aware of it, whatever it is, right? The speed of gravity continues to function. It is, in this case, a law of physics, right? And we're going to sort of, we'll work at the level of Newtonian physics rather than like quantum physics or something like this, right? The number of people who live in the town of Bellefonte, which is the town where I live, Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, that is an objective piece of information, right? We can count the number of people who live in the town, and that is true. That is something that exists about the world, right? It is something that is true that does not depend on a subject, on an observer, who have observed this and who have rendered some sort of judgment about it, right? So when we think about objectivity in terms of rhetoric, what we are really talking about is a description of things that exist in the world without depending on someone observing them, without depending on judgment, without depending on the assessment of someone, whatever it is, right? Subjectivity is the opposite, right? It is rooted in the subject's experience. That means the experience of usually the person, but some sort of conscious entity that is experiencing something. So subjectivity will often involve things like judgments, right? So is this a cool hat or not, right? This is not an objective question. We cannot like we can look at the hat and we can identify its various characteristics, the things about it. This, like, you can say this is a toque or a beanie or whatever you want to call it. It's made of, I think, a linen cotton blend. It's dark blue in color, etc., etc. These are objective things about it. Is it cool? I mean, I think so, but that's my subjective perspective, right? So there's an element of subjectivity that is often based in judgment. Another element of subjectivity is personal observations. So you think about, for instance, what an anthropologist does, right? An anthropologist may go out into the field and go to a specific group of people, and they will observe that group of people, their behaviors. Maybe they'll study their speech patterns or their religious beliefs, the way in which they distribute resources amongst the group, whatever it is that anthropologist is interested in, right? And so there's objective components to that, but there's also subjective components to that because it's rooted in that observer's observations, right? And so this is where things like replicability become really interesting and potentially challenging for disciplines like the social sciences. Because when you are dealing with something that is on some level connected to the ability of an observer to observe it, and that a different observer may observe things differently, you run into potential issues of sort of replicability, right? And in the social sciences, people are in principle trained to try to be as objective as possible, but you're dealing with subjective elements most of the time, right? So another place where we see this kind of thing would be political polling, right? You are asked to express your opinion, right? They don't do opinion polling about, like, what is the square meter size of the continent of Antarctica, right? Because that's not a subjective question. It's an objective question. It doesn't make a difference if 70% of the electorate said Antarctica is 1 square meter. That would not change the objective reality of the size of Antarctica, which I don't know off the top of my head. So the thing that often I think trips people up with this is, in the West, at least, not necessarily in all cultural traditions, but in Western culture, in the United States, Canada, Europe, we have a very strong tendency to weigh objective assessment more than subjective assessment. Anybody who's ever taught an English class can tell you this for sure, because consistently students will say, well, the grade that I got on this essay is really just subjective, right? They don't quote the dude, typically. They don't say, well, like, that's just your opinion, man. But that's essentially the argument, right? And this actually, in a significant way, misunderstands subjectivity, but it also doesn't. And this is a tricky thing, right? Because on the one hand, there's a level of subjectivity that is things like individual taste, individual preferences, individual biases, views, etc., etc. But there's also a level of subjectivity that is about the knowledge of a subject, the experience, the observational capacity of a subject, etc., etc. So I've been teaching various types of first-year writing courses since 2009. Over the course of that time, I've read probably thousands of student papers. By most metrics, I think, my I have plenty of experience to back up my ability to assess whether or not a first-year composition student's essay is well written and meets the standards set by a program. That is also part of subjectivity, right? It's not just, I feel this way with no basis to it. It's also, I bring my rational critical judgment to it and I assess it against standards of some kind, right? So these are sort of the big differences between subjectivity and objectivity, right? Objectivity, again, is very much externally focused. It is descriptive. It may be quantitative, but it is very much about what exists in the world and what can I say about it that is demonstrable and measurable in concrete ways. Subjectivity, for our purposes, again, there is that sort of like personal preference, random nonsense, right, that we sort of non-rationally bring to things. But when we're talking about this in terms of rhetoric, in terms of scholarship, argumentation, etc., we're thinking about subjectivity more in terms of I am utilizing my judgment and my ability to assess what's going on based on a backlog of my own experience, hopefully, but also based on certain standards. And that may be external standards, like the grading standards set by the program in writing and rhetoric here at Penn State, or that may be something like... So I recently wrote a review of a theater production that a couple of my friends were in, and one of my friends who was in it sent me an email about the review, and one of his critiques of the review was that I did not establish the standards against which I was assessing the play. I thought I did, to be fair to me, I said the performances were much better than the script. But the script, I think, was not good. And I didn't necessarily explicitly say, here are the standards I'm holding this to. What I did was I held that script to what I would call generic standards for the type of show that it is. So with this type of show, which was a murder mystery comedy dinner theater, what would I expect from a good show? Or what would I expect from an ideal show, right? And there is a certain degree to which people may agree or disagree about that. But then you render a critical judgment on the basis of those standards. So that's what we're thinking about here with subjectivity, right? And we in the West tend to lean toward objectivity because we believe that it is true, that it is vested with truth. And we tend to be more skeptical of subjectivity because we equate it with opinion. And we are cautious about opinion, which is not an unhealthy attitude to take. One of the problems becomes when we conflate objectivity and subjectivity. And this happens all the time, right? Especially with anyone who includes in their discourse a statement like, facts don't care about your feelings. What you often get in those instances is not an objective statement of facts. It is an interpretation of facts. And that's a crucial difference. And I've actually talked about this on the channel before, but this is where something objective slips into something objective slips into something subjective. I think I was saying that right, but immediately as I was saying the sentence, it felt wrong, right? So if you say, for instance, that there are 8 point whatever billion people on planet Earth, and the planet cannot sustain that population, you might claim that that is a fact statement, that it is an objective assessment and therefore true. But here's the problem. The first part is an objective statement. There are X number of people on the planet. We can measure that. That can be assessed, right? Our tools for measuring that are not entirely accurate, but we can say we could, in principle, count the total number of people who exist on planet Earth. But when you add the second part, that number of people is unsustainable. And people do make this argument. It's a Malthusian argument, and it's a very problematic argument for all of the reasons that Malthusian arguments are problematic. I could talk about those if you want, although that's not really what this channel does. But that is a subjective assessment. You're making a value judgment or a prediction about it. It's not something that can be objectively measured, right? There's nothing we can look at concretely in the world that would say this is unsustainable. What we have there is an assertion about the meaning of a piece of information. And this is where the whole objectivity and subjectivity debate often gets obscured, right? We have this sort of deliberate obfuscation of what's going on with objective versus subjective statements. Is people often either confuse or conflate or ignore the differences between a subjective or an objective fact about whatever subject and the subjective argument they're making about it. The meaning of a fact, the meaning of a piece of data, the meaning of a piece of information will almost always be subjective, because that meaning typically cannot be objectively measured, assessed, documented, etc., etc. It requires a judgment about it. So in this way, as much as we in the West discursively tend to gravitate toward and trust objectivity, subjectivity is what allows us to make meaning from the information that we have available to us. And that's a very important piece of the puzzle here.